What is up, theology nerds? Today on the podcast, Dr. Nichole Torbitzky is here. She is a theologian, a philosopher, and a chaplain at a university. And 10 years ago, she said that when she first started, students would visit Hindu temples as part of their world religions class and come back saying, wow, they're just people doing their own thing. And, God bless them, they're different. But now, those same field trips increasingly generate papers from students saying it's a shame. Those people, they're just going to hell. Well, what's changed? What can we learn about the shift in religious consciousness here in America? Well, I wanted to talk about that. And my friend Nichole Torbitzky is here, and she's been watching this shift in real time. And today she shares what it means to be a chaplain when the very nature of religious question and who gets to ask those questions is rapidly changing. I hope you dig this conversation as much as I did. And I want to give a special shout out to a longtime homebrewed Christianity listener and recently retired university chaplain whose email sparked this conversation. I hope you dig it. I hope you enjoy it. And if you're having fun, share the brew. Send this to someone else who might enjoy this conversation. And if you want to hang out in person, come on over to Theology Beer Camp this October 16th to 18th in St. Paul, Minnesota. TheologyBeerCamp2025.com. All right. Enjoy. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is Nichole Torbitzky, and who I just discovered is on the precipice of a new semester and a new class this year. So, there's a lot of preparation running through her brain right now.
It's all good stuff.
All good stuff. Well, okay, so I got an email from a retired university chaplain who recently retired, mid-70s, so stayed at the university for a long time. And in the email, he's describing getting to a point where he had the hardest time even understanding undergrad students and how the big questions that a chaplain's tending to show up. And that, there was a time, obviously you're close in age when you first start in a position like that, and then you stay in contact. It's easy to stay invigorated because you're relating to them and this. And at some point, he said, I just felt so culturally alien to them that I didn't think I could do a good job. And I would love for you to talk to somebody who is much younger and doing it to help to help me reflect on this giant gap that he came to experience. And I can understand that, just trying to think, you, even just being a youth minister, the transitions that happen as you get older. But someone who I know the university absolutely loved their service, and people that were like, this is the best part of my undergrad experience, got to the point that culture is changing at a pace that I don't even know how to give the gifts of what I have, even though I can be present and listen, but I can't. And so then I thought, who is a friend of mine who works with undergrad students in a similar kind of context, and I just want to go talk to them about it. So first, tell us about your own context and situation. But that was the prompting that I was like, no, I want to talk to Nichole about this, because we had little bitty conversations and stuff around this in the past, but we haven't talked about being a philosophical theologian and talking about those kinds of questions as they show up in students in a context where there's multiple religious traditions and none and all that. And so, yeah. So introduce us to your setting, and then we can, see what happens.
So I am in a small private university in a very red state. So in Missouri, in one of the reddest counties in one of the reddest states, St. Charles County. And the university that I'm at is Lindenwood University. I'm part of the College of Arts and Humanities. And I serve in two capacities here. I'm both a philosophy and religion professor, and then also the university chaplain. So I have a really nice perspective on what's going on with my students, because I get to see them as a professor, but then I also get to often work with them as their chaplain.
How long have you been in that context?
11 years.
11 years. Have you noticed changes in the way kind of life's biggest questions show up? Has that changed over the last 10 years in your experience there?
I think how life's biggest questions, what they are, remain the same. I think how they're approached, maybe how they get asked. And as we had discussed earlier, the lack of a shared culture, not the lack of a shared culture, maybe a more diffuse shared culture makes it a little bit harder for people to be connecting these days. So I think the questions remain the same. I think the diffuse shared culture makes it a little more difficult to talk with each other instead of past each other.
Yeah. Maybe for someone that's never been worked at a university system, let alone in the kind of like weird space of being chaplain-ish, where like even when schools are grounded in a particular tradition, that doesn't mean the student body is. So like, how do you imagine like your own task when encountering different students from different places, but they come to you going like, here is an experience, pain, question, struggle I have. What is it like to show up to it well when, you know, you don't have the same kind of assumptions you can make when people from even your own congregation show up?
Right. I actually am really, really blessed. So at my university, half of the student body reports itself as being some kind of religion. So about half of those report themselves as being Catholic. And then half of our religious students are like, of our non-Catholic Christian students are across the board, every different Christian denomination. And then we have a very small Muslim and Jewish population here at the school. And the Catholic students and the Protestant students are asking a lot of the same questions. They just tend to ask them in slightly different ways. And I get to be lucky to work with all of them. And the big questions, once again, are, as I think they've always been, like, who am I? And what is my relationship to God? And how does my particular religious faith help to define that or guide that? And I do get a lot of students who deconstruct. They get here and they feel, I think, many of them pretty uncomfortable with that, right? I think it's a real uncomfortable space to be in, especially students who come from backgrounds where the religion itself tends to be relatively high control or pretty hierarchical. And they get to college and they're exposed to, you know, my world religions class. And students will come to me afterward and be like, wait. How do I make sense of the fact that all of these other religions make truth claims? And I've always been told that Jesus is the only way. Right?
That is a feature of existence that, you know, if we went back in time 100 years, was a challenge for a rather small group of people, right? Like people whose probably academic or vocation thing put them in contact, right, with a multiplicity of different forms of life, religious traditions and such. And now that the experience that generates that question in a one that makes one shake about it is just ever more present. The number of people that question around meaning, like what happens when like the street you live on have multiple historic religious traditions on it. Those traditions do not demonstrate a better or worse ability to form human beings. Some of, like in the same religious tradition, you can like storm the Capitol or protest the cutting of AIDS funding in Africa, right? Like you know, and then you can have people that are not religious in any traditional sense who are have just as compelling and beautiful lives. And so that just makes a question we could all ask metaphysically, like, oh, well, I'm going to think about the meaning of life and the narratives that form it and something. All of a sudden, it feels different when it becomes not just a metaphysical question, but an existential one. Like, how do I find meaning in life when the meaning I'm finding in life is connected to particular narratives, but my street has a multiplicity of them on it? And how we navigate that is something that I don't think we're very good at yet. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons you have like a lot of kind of, you know, big thinkers talking about like meaning crisis or or these kinds of things, or like in response surveys, a growth of people with, would get that the data would be like, oh, well, they have a struggle with nihilism, or, this kind of thing. And underneath it, it seems that, or the psychological account of it, in most kind of psychology of religion or social psych stuff, is that meaning traditionally is found in belonging. And communities of belonging have shared narratives and assumptions and rituals and forms. And it doesn't have to be religious, but belonging and meaning coincide. So what happens when you show up as a steward of meaning and you're facilitating it with people that have a host of different belongings and those that have just baggage from where they came from? Like, I feel like that is a new context. And I can understand, right, while getting an email from someone who was an amazing steward of belonging when the primary constituency at a university was various Christian traditions or Christian adjacent or atheist, but a reference point was Christian or Jewish, to going, I don't know what to do now, when half of them have no religious reference point. Does that make sense? I was just thinking about his email and going, that connection of meaning and belonging is so different now than it just was 30 years ago. What the vocation, like your job description may read the same, but it's definitely not the same.
It's definitely not the same. So one of the things that I've tried to do with our religious groups is, and they still give me pushback against this 11 years later, I make a representative from the group get together with me once a month from all of my groups. So I have a Muslim student group and a Jewish student group. For a little while, I had a Buddhist student group, and I make them get together and I make them sit in the same room together. So the Catholic student group and the different evangelical student groups, they all have to get together and we all sit in the same room and we talk about what we're doing. And I encourage them to start doing things together. And this has been, I think, really helpful for them to develop a practice of identity together. Right? Like, because to say, for me to tell them, this is how we do things, this is how we do life together, isn't going to work. Like, they have to work it out in practice. And so they do. They have our student group, our Muslim student group has partnered with several of our Christian groups to do things together. And when things went terribly wrong, October 7th of 2 years ago, like, I got to mediate with our Jewish student group and our Muslim student group to help them try to find how we can live together on this campus and disagree deeply politically and still have some common ground. And what's that common ground? I wish I could just give a one-sentence answer to that. The common ground is this. The common ground is our life together. And it seems to be something that we're currently working out together.
One of the things I can imagine in a situation like that is, what are the features of the leader from each of these groups that show up that they all share in common that won't be shared by just all the people that participate in those groups? Like, when someone goes, okay, well, I guess we have to do this because Nichole said we had to, but then the person that ends up actually going regularly and such, like, created a space where something that generated a host of different controversial responses or competing responses after, October 7th and then everything that came after that, there was something that was generated by those relationships that made it conversable when that would not be a given assumption in lots of other spaces. So, like, when you think of maybe the Venn diagram of what those individuals have in common and what kind of belonging they all had in that regular get together that generated that kind of space, like, how do you see that, or what did you learn from that?
So it seems to me that every single one of the leaders that show up to these meetings and then show up to do events, especially interreligious events around campus, they're all deeply committed to their own faith. And they also understand, it seems to me, that even being deeply committed to one's own faith, they can understand that someone else is deeply committed to their faith. And that might be one of the things that is very different now than it was, say, even 50 years ago. It seems to me that all of my leaders understand that even if they disagree, and deeply disagree, that person actually sincerely believes what they believe, right? And that, I think, creates a space where they can at least come together to talk about the issues. And to be fair, I have had students who are like, I'm not in for this because I so deeply believe what I believe that I can't be in those spaces. And I've seen that a lot more recently. When I started 11 years ago, it seems like there was much more leaning into the kind of collaboration and interfaith work. And lately, it seems like there's been a whole lot more, I'll come to interfaith work just so I can try to convert people. I have seen that more and more and more recently, but at least in the space that I tend to create and the way that students come to me, it seems to be like, okay, we're all here and we all believe what we deeply believe. And I can respect that you have that deep belief. And now it's time for us to talk about maybe what our commonalities are. And there are plenty.
One of the other elements that like just comes to mind of the university context is unlike graduate school, most people start undergrad within a year or two of finishing high school. So like that space is this, well, now it's like the new adolescence of modernity, of late modern context. And so like it's those that go to a university, especially a residential one, are at a similar point in their life. You get the kind of moving out of the kind of sphere of belonging they were born into, which and then to a different space. So like it generates all sorts of questions that even if they come from different contexts, the context that they're in, the university one, being in classes with diverse peers and stuff, there is a kind of shared experience that allows engagement across difference that, you know, really after you get in the quote real world, it is not easy to find spaces where there's at least enough of what's going on in your life in common to figure out how to relate across difference, right? That's why your discussion of leaders of all these different faith groups sounds so much more cooperative than the same leadership group of those faith groups in the same town when they don't share university life.
I've been to some of the interfaith events here in the greater St. Louis area and have watched more bickering and infighting among particular groups, right? Like Christians will fight with each other with way more vehemence, maybe, than Christians will fight with Muslims or the Jewish groups that we meet with. So I guess in a way that's kind of, but at least at Lindenwood, everybody's got we do have a lot of things in common. Like everybody hates the line for Starbucks. We have a Starbucks on campus and everybody hates that line. It doesn't matter what religion you are. The line is always too long. And that's right.
Bringing
no matter
the
what
people
religion
together.
you are, everybody parks
Whether
terribly.
you want Starbucks unionized or not.
It seems to me like when we do a deep study, and a lot of my student leaders will come and take a religion class with me. Not all of them, but a lot of them will, particularly the world religions course, because we still at Lindenwood have a requirement that students have to take humanities outside of just English. And so we'll see how long that lasts. But so a lot of them get exposed to either philosophy or religion. And one of the things that we get to do here is look at how maybe, I don't want to make the claim that maybe in their day, even though that might be the case, but at least now when we get down to what most of the originators and some of the very early thinkers in these religions did things, they're kind of countercultural. They're kind of subversive. And it seems to me there's been a real pushback in this most recent group to that observation, right? That no, Jesus wasn't countercultural. Jesus wasn't pushing back. Jesus was encouraging you to be as complacent and in line with current society's norms as possible. No, Muhammad wasn't pushing back against the way things were on the Arabian Peninsula. Muhammad was attempting to encourage you to be just exactly how we tell you you're supposed to be now. And it's possible that this is the way things have always been. It was for a long time a lot harder to accept that. And it seems to me like the narratives in most religious movements across the world today have moved away from recognizing the kind of countercultural revolutionary ideas introduced by their founders and towards nationalism, towards just accepting the mainstream and not asking a lot of questions, and tendency away from a lot of the insights, the deep insights into how the divine works and how the relationship between the divine and the human is, away from those kinds of insights that make life better, ethical, fulfilling, spiritual.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I wonder if there's a unique difficulty in responding or engaging students that are in that space within your own tradition, right? So, like if you're those individuals probably also not sure you as a female could be ordained, so that is a whole nother complication. But like when you as a Christian, when students that you're theoretically attempting to serve and care for across traditions or none are like, yeah, I love Jesus, and that's why I have my cool MAGA hat, or that's why I support this immigration policy, or that's why whatever. Like, when I was a campus minister, I was a campus minister within a tradition, not generic. Like, so, like, what is it like? How do you like serve, challenge, support an expression of your own tradition that you are just like, when I think of idolatry, you come to mind? I mean, I don't know what I would. I think I would probably get in trouble. Like that. Because I just know, like, at some point I would say something, and then they would tell the university president, and they would look at me and be like, "Tripp, did you tell a student group that quote insert something?" I'm like, well, basically. Sorry.
So one of the challenges to my particular setting, since we're not connected to a particular doctrine or religious group, is just that. Like, I don't get to tell anybody what is orthodox or what isn't orthodox. And what I tell them is, it's not my job to tell you what to think. It's my job to teach you how to think and then give you interesting things to think about. So in like the group context where I have the leaders of my student religious group show up, we've been discussing, let's call them a high control group, right? That is not a registered group on campus, but they continue to come onto campus. They continue to try to recruit students. And we have, as a university, said, you're not allowed here. This is private property. Please go away. And as we've had discussions about them, I'll see my students get into, well, they're not a good group because we disagree with their doctrine or their philosophy this way. And my response has always been, it's not our job to police people's views, right? On this university, their theology is welcome, even if you disagree with it. The reason why they're not allowed is because they continue to break the university rules about interfering with people as they go about their daily lives. Religion on our campus is run by students, so we don't let outside churches just come in and proselytize all over the place and bother people while they're going about their business. So it puts me in a good space. I think that builds trust. So when I called my group back to some accountability to what we do at Lindenwood and why we do it this way, I think in the end that builds trust. I didn't get on board with, we don't want them here because we don't like their theology. That makes everybody's theology welcome, right? It makes me kind of trustworthy. And so there are certain students who will never come to me because I'm the wrong gender. But it seems to me when I called our group back to what we do and how we do it and why we do it, then it makes it easier for them to come to me because they know I won't be judgmental about what they do and how they do it and why they do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's hopeful. One of the things I'd be interested in, and is thinking about the retired chaplain that emailed me, is like, how has the rise of the nuns changed over just like the last decade in your own context, and what have you learned about being an ally with individuals who aren't grounded in a specific tradition, right? Because one of the gifts of someone that teaches world religions, and if you've done this in undergrad, is like, well, maybe everyone doesn't do this, but people that teach world religions who happen to just be process philosophers, like one of the perks of that class is you get to go like, okay, so let's imagine there are all these long traditions in the world. You know what they're responding to? The gift of ultimacy. And it has their own particular tradition and wisdom, and they've been evolving and changing over time. So when you meet a wisdom tradition, there's something in it that is given so much life that generation after generation, you couldn't tell your own identity to the next generation without it. So they all have to be known and treasured. And I'm about to get up here and introduce you to mine, but all the others, because it's just so freaking cool that we live in a world where we get to encounter the multiplicity of traditions. Like, humans haven't been doing that very long, and you get to hear it. So I'm going to try to make you think each religion I introduce over the next week, each week, is the coolest one of all time, and that you don't even know how to be human without the wisdom you gain from it. Yeah, boom, you get pumped like that. That's such, like, I enjoy that. But then you get to like, and so you hope, like, when you describe their own tradition, they're like, hey, Nichole loves this. And when you describe, and you're like, I thought she was Christian. You're like, yeah, but I also think Taoism is cool. So like that is such a different thing than showing up where there's not one, right? Where you're not going to someone going, I know I'm not Muslim, but let me tell you about these beautiful texts, or here's this poetry, or here's a story from history. All of a sudden you're tending to someone, and you as someone who loves all these narratives and traditions are like, which one am I helping you introduce to? And the example he gave in his email, he said it was like talking where a growing number of individuals at the university showed up after being in state custody and don't know their family of origin. And so they're showing up where so many of the people around them have a family story and they don't have one, but they still want to know who they are, what is the good, and how to belong. And he said, I just realized I didn't know how to talk to someone that couldn't tell me what family they came from. I learned how to talk to people of any religious family because I loved it. And I just came to grow so much in my own faith because I got to know all these traditions. But now there are all these people, and I'm like, I don't know what to do, because I can exist in any tradition as your ally. But what do I do when there's not one? I feel dirty because now I'm proselytizing, and I'm so too progressive for that. So does that make sense? And I thought it was such a great analogy.
That is a great analogy. Okay, so let me back up just a little bit. I remember teaching a world religions course and waxing sort of poetic and excited about some of the great things in Islam. And finally, one of my students had courage. From the back of the classroom, she raises her hand and she's like, how can you love Islam so much and still be Christian? All I can do is do what you just did, right? Like here's all of these amazing traditions. And I believe, from my process metaphysical perspective, that God is bigger than an individual religion. What I can say to that student, instead of trying to give them a metaphysics lesson, which it was real tempting, is that I love Jesus and I love the things that Jesus has to say about how the world works. And that is convincing to me. But I can love and respect the things that Muhammad had to say to the world and about how the world works. And there's some really beautiful and guiding things in there that I need. So it was satisfying, at least to that class. It hasn't been satisfying to everyone who comes. If you can see, like behind me, there's a tapestry with verses from the Quran. And so I've had other people who are very committed Christians come and sit in my office and be like, well, how can you love these other religions and even teach them and still call yourself Christian? And I can give them the same answer. It's just less satisfying to them. But that same answer works, I think, with the nuns as well. Right? Like, Jesus works for me. And honestly, the things that Jesus has to say probably work for a lot of people, most people out there, even people who consider themselves nuns, especially if they grew up in the United States. Typically what they don't like is what organized religion is doing and how Christianity and Jesus have been co-opted by the dominant narrative in society today to be a bludgeon. So I can and often do deal with the nuns because they don't. I appreciate your chaplain friends email, like they don't have a family of origin, but they do. They do have a family of origin. They've got this kind of cultural mix of America, which up until really recently was, and might still be, we live in a place where everyone can live this American dream. Right? We live in a place where everyone can be who they want to be. Right? We live in a place where we can live together in harmony because religion isn't the thing that defines our lives. So, and even if you happen to be religious and I happen to be non-religious, we can still live together because we have this common ground of these societal laws that we have all bought into. And so up until very recently, when Christian nationalism started to really take a bite out of the American dream, there was this real common ground. And most of my students who identify as none or nothing or non-religious have that story as their family of origin. And they begin to have common ground, honestly, through video games, particularly the young men. They've got a lot of common ground in the video games that they all played, which the thing that I ought to do is start playing video games.
Well, do you know Ben Chica? He was at Claremont, but I think it would have been after you. I think he was like,
I don't think I met Ben.
okay. He's the president of the Tillich Society now, but his newest book is on video games. And it was superb. And I think you're right? Like part of even the example of video games, or right, like this kind of national, like the American dream is a kind of a cultural and economic mythology. Like one of the gifts, I think, of a theology of culture is the recognition that, historically there are these religious traditions. And in them, there are these questions, these perennial questions of humanity that show up in religious traditions. But those questions don't stop being asked when the historic traditions there, they take other forms, right? And that was one of the things Paul Tillich in his early work on thinking theologically about culture was saying to religious leaders, like, so often we show up and are going to tell everyone what the correct question is, and then give them the right answer. And oftentimes, religious traditions are answering a question that an anxiety 3 or 4 generations ago asked, and now you're witnessing, in scare quotes, turns into convincing everyone they have a problem they don't even know they have, right? So right. If you go to a student who's non-religious and you're like, have you ever lied? That's called sin. And you have to convince them they're a sinner, that matters before you can tell them the gospel. It's like, why are you doing that? And it's not like Tillich's point is like, oh, well, if you have an anxiety about whether you're known and lovable, then there's the gospel can respond to that, but you don't have to give everyone the same problem. And so the part of the challenge when you don't have these larger narratives and traditions of belonging are actually getting to know the narratives where those questions get raised and taking those questions as if they bear the weight of setting the terms for engagement. Right. And I think that I think that's really hard to do, especially for someone who like really loves the one they have. Right. Like, I wonder, like, would Paul Tillich, one of the things about him, like, he developed that so much more after he moves to America. Right now he's having to learn how to speak English because he escaped the Nazis and all that kind of thing. And it's like, he gets to American religion and he's like, these people are crazy. Like, he doesn't understand American Christianity, but he connects to the art scene in New York and then this kind of thing. And he'd already been thinking about culture. And then it's like, well, where are the biggest questions being asked in this place that's my new home? And if he hadn't had that lens, and you could imagine showing up, from in America and going like, this is an important thing to state because most of the Christians around here don't take, quote, secular culture seriously. And I always found that sense that, for him, he's like, no, learning to read and exegete culture well is taking seriously that each human and each community bears the image of God. To be human is to exist as addressed. So in what ways does that address express itself in questions of meaning and value? And that's a different way of thinking about our vocation, right, as theologians or as chaplains in a increasingly diverse space is, what is it like to tend to the questions as if the question itself is sacred, rather than whatever the particular answer is of your particular group within a specific tradition?
I do this wonderful thing on campus. I call it pop-up prayers. And so I put on my collar because that helps people be less confused. And I and I put on my name tag so that they know I'm just not some random off the street. And then I put up a sandwich board that explains who I am. I'm the university chaplain. Do you need prayer? And I've learned that everyone, regardless of their denomination, will come and pray with me if they need prayer. I've also learned that a lot of the people who don't identify as religious will still come and pray. And I always ask some clarifying questions beforehand. Who are you? What do we need to pray for? Right. And that gives me a sense of what tradition they're in, what their need is. But a lot of times the nuns will come to me. And their problems are the same, right? My family is having issues. I'm having issues in my relationships. I'm having issues with my classes. And I don't know sometimes where my next meal is coming from, which, by the way, we've got a food pantry on campus. So it gives me an opportunity to get into the lives of a lot of students who wouldn't show up at a student religious group meeting. And it seems to me like my nuns are likely to come and pray with me. But the same reliance on a divine intervention isn't what they're looking for. The connection. It's the chance to know that you've got somebody else who wants the same things, who put that kind of, I talked to them about putting that kind of goodness into the universe, right? Let's put this goodness into the universe. Let's put this need, this, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm having brain fog this morning. This desire into the universe. And then that goodness could result in some goodness, right? Let's make it together. And they almost always go away better, feeling more connected, and then knowing that they've got an ally on campus, even though I identify as a religious person, that I don't need them necessarily to identify as a religious person. And it seems to me that this group of nuns is, as you say, asking slightly different questions. Like, they're no longer concerned with what happens after they die. A lot of them. When I ask in my world religions classes, or when I talk with the people who are nuns and are asking me to pray with them for someone who's going to die, they're not super worried about an afterlife.
Which is odd in the sense that the millennials and Gen Z are more likely to believe in an afterlife than boomers and older. Like, on response surveys, like, do you think there is? I find that to be one of the, like, you don't get it as an existential worry, but you get it as a inherited belief that they affirm. Like, and that's just a fun dynamic where you're like, that's because when I read the data, I was like, that's wild. Like, the kind of, in some sense, beliefs go last, right? Like, belonging to a particular religious tradition, you can, like, oh, I get rid of that. Then you still, a lot of times, still have the moral convictions of one, even if you don't actually belong. And then the beliefs go last. So, like, when you're looking at beliefs survey, it's hard to tell if someone's none. If you're just asking them, well, do you believe in an ultimate reality, or, this kind of thing.
I haven't seen that data. I'd love to.
It hadn't come out. I think it had come out in the podcast later this week, but Ryan Birch has been did this big, like, the largest survey of people who are nuns, and then they have a big project on a typology of the different kinds of nuns based on these, like, both like survey data and follow-up stuff and things. And one of the features of it that I was surprised by when I first looked at it was like, ooh, I would not have guessed. Oh, well, do you believe in the afterlife? I'm like, 80% of people, who are these people? Like, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I was just shocked at, like, so that maybe you have less, like, you doubt more in the middle of your life. It was It was wild. But it's not like when you ask a belief question, you ask like, what is the existential significance of this belief? So oftentimes you can answer a belief question, and it's not something you've thought or worried or care about. It's just like, well, okay, well, if I have to answer this, because it's just how data part works. But yeah, anyway.
Right. And the for the nuns, at least the beliefs tend to be across the board. Maybe there's an afterlife. Maybe there's not. There's probably reincarnation. Maybe not. And that doesn't seem to be the concern. And actually, that kind of makes sense for the young people that I deal with across the board, regardless of their religious affiliation or none. It's like, how do I get a job? How do I buy a house? How do I afford to have kids? Right? Like, how do I get out of this environment? How do I get this degree so that I can have an actual life? And that's not true for all. I mean, certainly there are plenty of people who are concerned with the disposition of their life after this world. But at least for the nuns, not so much. Right? But
yeah.
What do I do?
So I pulled it up. Here we go. Okay. So, do you believe in the afterlife? And this is by generation. Boomers, 79%. Believe in the afterlife. Gen X, 83. Millennials, 87. Gen Z, 83. So the lowest are boomers.
Oh, that's interesting.
And millennials are a little higher, but and if you asked before the pandemic, Gen Z was the highest. They were at 89%, 88 and 89 before the pandemic and dropped to 83. After the pandemic, millennials afterlife stuff went up, and the boomers and Gen X have been more consistent over the last 10 years. So, but none of them go like, but they don't, this is what I imagine you would ask when you're sitting there. I was talking to Ryan. I'm like, so do they ask why or how important this is? And he goes, Tripp, you would be the worst person ever to be giving this survey. You'd take all day with one person. and I was like, oh, okay.
I wonder, I've got all sorts of speculation as to why that would be. I would just be speculating though.
I know. That's that's why so Ryan and I will do these things every so often. I don't know, every month or so, every couple months, and he'll pick a topic and then so this is why philosophers are real bad at this, is like, you have this ongoing internally consistent system that you're using to interpret all things, and then you're trying to figure it out, and he's like, we can't tell that from the data. We can't tell it anyway. So it makes it both like looking at the data and fun, because he just looks at me like, oh, you philosophers. And I'm just like, you have this many people you're asking the questions and don't even ask the follow-up? Yeah.
Right?
One of the things that I'm interested in what it looks like to be a support system for something that, you're not an active participant in the sense of your support system for multiple traditions, but you don't occupy within it. Because one of the things I've noticed, especially in university or in intellectual context, is because we read texts and then to talk about them, we tend to think religions are their ideas or beliefs and things in ways that just isn't how religion really works, right? So we tend to use an epistemology that for thinking about religion that we use for thinking about other things in the university context, right? Where like you as the observer aren't supposed to be bringing something into it, and the experiment should be replicated regardless of which person in the class does this, because that's how this chemical responds to this, and this kind of thing. And when we have that kind of epistemology, it sets up for looking at statements about ultimacy the same way a statement about how gravity works or something like that, and you go, oh, well, is this tradition or practice or belief true? And most philosophers of religion have this task of asking if it's true about a religious practice or tradition prior to being formed by it. Just means you don't exactly know what you're talking about. It's like asking someone to marry you, promise them a life of love and fidelity on the first date. You just don't know each other yet. And faith, a lot like love, is something you must know the meaning of before you can say yes to it, right? And so there's this different kind of religious or spiritual epistemology of one of enactment, involvement, engagement, as opposed to detachment. and like the truths of any religious tradition, which is what you're trying to like articulate when you're even doing a world religion one. You're like, it's made manifest against a background of this community of commitment and emotional involvement. And so like I have in any clergy of, or steward of any tradition knows what, like, oh, here's how I would invite them into my own. But when everyone has this in the university has this tendency of disengagement, that kind of epistemology, and then you have people of other traditions there, what is it like to celebrate that there are mysteries in all these traditions that you actually just don't have access to until you enact them? Right? Like, you don't know what it's like to be a disciple till you actually are doing the things Jesus said. You don't know what it's like to be a Muslim until these truths become enacted in your life, or you do the prayer and such. And I wonder if that figuring out how to both celebrate the entanglement of that kind of knowing while there's multiple balls of entanglement isn't a growing task just for religious life in our modern context.
Right. So the academic tradition, the university tradition, so the way we tend to teach philosophy and even religion courses is from that very Protestant perspective. Like, what does your book say? And then that's the truth. And it took me a minute to stop that, because as you point out, that's not what the book says, isn't necessarily what the religion is. So when I teach a world religions course, I have been moving away from here's what their book is, here's what their book says, here's the history of the development, and have started attempting to emphasize here's what the people in this religion do today. So let's go to the mosque. Let's go to the synagogue. We have an amazing Hindu temple in St. Louis. It's the only one in the state of Missouri. It's beautiful. And I take people there and make them go every chance I have. Because you get to see when you go that people are just people. And so early on, when I started taking people, say, to the Hindu temple of St. Louis, they'd get there and they'd be like, wow, people are just people, and like the needs that they have and the wants that they have are very, very similar. And real recently, I've started to get papers back where people are like, oh yeah, they're all just people. It's really a shame they're going to hell. For the first time in 11 years. So that question of, is it true, is now prevalent in the religious life of people in a way I don't think it was even 5 years ago. It's 10 years ago, I brought people and they're like, wow, they're great and they're doing great and they get to do their own thing in their own time. And that's awesome. And God bless them in that journey. And I'm going to continue to do mine. And if they want to come be a Christian, I'd be more than happy to. And there's been a real shift in the last few years, especially among people who are very committed Christians, to, gosh, I'm real sorry they're going to hell.
Oh.
Because they seem like really nice people.
Uh-huh.
And so there's a real disconnect there. And so I think that this way that I was kind of trained to teach, which is there's beauty and truth in each of these religions. And as you pointed out, everybody's kind of got their own ultimate, right? Each religion has their own goal, and it's the lived experience of those that is the important part. Because doctrine, what your book has to say, isn't really the truth of it. It's the lived experience. Yeah. And it doesn't seem to be the way things are going right now, particularly among Christians. I haven't heard that as much from my Muslim or Jewish students, but my Christian students, more and more of them have gotten to this, like, my way or the highway.
Yeah, I wonder if that's like a consequence of being kids who were raised, if they were, if they're conventionally Christian or in an intense way, that those going into college now were raised by in churches that are much more self-conscious about its waning cultural influence, right? And if you just think of, like, remember compassionate conservatism of George Bush that changed the impact of the life expectancy of people with HIV/AIDS over in Africa? That was evangelicals that even convinced Jesse Helms that it's a Christian thing to do and a conservative thing to do, to spend lots of money giving people drugs. Now, not a lot of money compared to the military-industrial complex, which we expanded in every budget since then. But they just think when you and I were in undergrad, the consensus of evangelicalism wanted to think of itself as compassionate and conservative at the same time. But after 9/11 and Barack Obama's election, Nick, it's gotten more, like that becomes more and more foreign to the point that those that are in college now, like they don't remember how democracy or religion worked before 9/11. They live in the aftermath of it. Their reference point of presidents, why they have memory, are like Trump, Biden, lockdown, Jan 6th, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. Like you go through the list of like the things that showed them what religion or the good or the public square, all those kind of things look like. And it is an ugly, contested thing. And if you're in the Christian tradition, where a white one, where the most public enactment of it is a more universal support of Donald Trump and company than even the other white evangelicals that have ran for president, then you can imagine, right, this shift of what the center of evangelicalism is not one where you feel really convicted when Tony Campolo comes and are like, you should probably feed more hungry people and care about justice. Now, like, you get like QAnon adjacent stuff and things. So, part of what I think may be happening is just what is the consensus of the churches where these kids are coming from, even if the churches are the same ones sending people, who remained in those churches and then, were facilitating youth group or Sunday school or preaching, has changed. That now, like, that anxiety about whether we're still going to be culture dominant is a zero-sum game, as opposed to it's easier to not think zero-sum when you just assume we're going to be culture dominant. So we can be nice to our other neighbors. But now that it's waning, you're like, no, we are true.
I think it might be a little bit of pushback, too, against the kind of theology that came out of, say, Tillich or even Hick, right? Like, we've got this, everybody's got their own goals and everybody's allowed to have their own goals and we can all live together and be respectful of each other and we'll all continue on that way. And there's been, I think, a real pushback against that in a lot of our more evangelical churches, that no, that's not the way it is. Like, we've got the truth and we are the only truth. And you just have to accept that those people who don't believe exactly the kind of Christianity that you do are going to end up in hell and are wrong and don't have the truth. And it's been an interesting kind of shift to see. And it might be, as you say, because Christianity in its various forms was just the status quo and no one was threatened. But we're still, even as we as Americans continue to become less white, we still remain very, very Christian. It still is the underpinning of our society and basically the status quo in the United States. Even people who understand themselves to be none are still using a kind of Christian moral compass, Christian kind of ethically based and even legal society, right? Like many of our rules are still based on Christian notions and that come out of Judaism and the legal code there. So we still are very, very, very Christian. And nonetheless, there's still been this push towards we're the only truth, right? My brand of Christianity is the only truth. And that kind of pushback and the people who can accept it is something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. It's still relatively new because it runs contrary to a lot of the things that we believe as Americans, the ideal of American, let me put that way. The idea we hold up as Americans, but also the kind of phenomenological, the experiential aspect of what it means to be Christian, because you don't anymore live next to people who believe exactly like you do. And maybe that's it, because we've come to a world that is so global, where there is, like, your neighbors might not be exactly the same kind of Christian you are. Maybe so. Maybe you're right. Maybe, though, there's something else going on there. This kind of push across the world towards religious nationalism. I mean, we see it in India, we see it in Middle Eastern countries, Muslim countries, we've seen it in Christian countries. This kind of conflating your religion with your national identity seems to be happening everywhere. It's going to be interesting to see how what you and I seem to believe is true of Christianity isn't necessarily what some of my students, these poor students of mine who think that anyone who's not their exact brand of Christian is going to hell. We've got some real differences there we're going to have to try to bridge.
Yeah. Okay. What you just said reminds me of this line. I'm going to pull it up because I was reading Louis Dupree's. He had this essay on the changing nature of religion and modernity. And it has this line that makes me think of what you're saying, in the sense that, well, I'll just read the quote and then tell you what was popping in my head, because I put it in my notes yesterday. He said, "Here lies Christianity's present predicament. In the past, religious integration was handed down by a tradition, but that tradition itself has lost its authority in the eyes of our contemporaries, including most believers. What then ought the Christian do to survive as a genuine believer? I see no alternative but that he or she must now personally integrate what tradition did in the past. Nothing in culture compels our contemporaries to embrace a religious faith. If they do, they alone are responsible for allowing their faith to incorporate all aspects of their existence. Hence, the vital importance of a spiritual life." And I think if you recognize that predicament that he's talking about and don't actually trust an integrative spiritual life or the community that's integrated in enacting it to be compelling, then all your anxiety gets poured into controlling culture, where we try to create a reality where it's not the case that there's this new burden in a late modern context that the individual has to do what traditions used to do for everyone. And there's lots of elements to it, but I like just your description there, and then thinking about reading that last night and liking it, going, oh, if you thought, well, we can't really make the enactment of this spiritual life compelling. What's the other solution? Let's dominate culture again. What makes that hunch, in a sense, make more sense is it's in the recognition that we'd like to control culture again, because the life of faith isn't compelling enough, that you then turn to a leader who, well, their personal life doesn't even feign a commitment to the shared values of the tradition. They actually don't have them, and would use power in the opposite way, and that actually makes your allegiance to them intoxicating.
Oh, I like that. Right. So, right, authority as a way to institute shared values rather than what we at least think religion used to do. And attempting to leave that, I love that quote. So attempting to leave it up to the individual, though, like what your spiritual life would be, what your religious commitments would be, and leaving that entirely up to an individual leaves a lot of individuals without the psychic energy to devote to that adrift and at a loss, and wanting to fill that hole. And so authority, even if it doesn't jive with the truth of the tradition, fills that really easily. And it gives shared identity, which I think is, in some ways, one of the answers to the loneliness epidemic that's happening in the world today. This is a way of having shared identity and having shared values. That's one of the functions of religion. The question is, are these the values we want to have? How do we invite people into a religious shared identity that supports the values that are good for the individual in the world? And so, boy, is that a loaded question. What's good? What's shared values? What's identity? I don't believe, like Whitehead says, that religion is what an individual does in their solitude. That could be spirituality, maybe. But religion is something we do together. And the authority of the kind of demagogues and national religions that seem to be springing up right now do a good job doing that, right? They do a good job of doing religion together. They do a great job at it, as a matter of fact. What figures like Jesus and Muhammad and the Buddha did was to call to accountability when those things had gotten out of hand in their days.
Yeah, okay, two things just popped in my head. One is in philosophy of religion, when I taught that, there's this weird element that you could teach philosophy of religion by talking about three figures who never wrote anything. And it's Socrates, Jesus, and Buddha. And yet there's lots written about them. And there's this sense that the philosophical life, like the unexamined life is not worth living, and all those kind of, that vibe that philosophers dig when it's existentially engaged philosophy. Paul Ricoeur had this line about it that I used in philosophy of religion is like a prompt. When I would sometimes just try to get students to think about anything before I set the stage, because so many people want their professor to like them, to give them a grade. And you're sitting there going like, oh, this is so cool. I get to talk about this stuff, but I get to learn things because y'all's mind hasn't already been framed by all the things you're supposed to think when we talk about this. So I'm looking for new material, things I haven't asked before, or like whatever. And so, Ricoeur has this line where he's talking about like, what is it, these kind of figures hold in common. And he goes, until you reconcile yourself with these two truths, you'll never live. You will have enemies and you will die. And like the wisdom of what Socrates, Jesus, and Buddha have in common is like, you need to, like, your life, even though they have different visions, there are places that overlaps and all this kind of stuff. Like the life well lived, or the wise life, is one that knows like you will have enemies. So then how do you figure out who they are and all that kind of thing? And you will die. You're going to do something your finitude, which changes how you values it and how you understand it and all these kind of things. And just thinking about how all three of them answer those questions differently, but they answer them passionately, which creates like synergy between them. And oftentimes the worst expressions of religions are ones that lose no sleep about what enemies they're going to have. They don't think about their own finitude and like how finitude structures meaning and stuff like that. And that sense that when he frames these two questions is two truths, until you reconcile yourself with these two truths. That doesn't mean answer them, but like, oh, I have to carry this question. You'll never live. It's going, there is a way you can never live before you die. And what those three figures, are provoking is a sense of, let's learn to live before we die. Just the way he frames it, right? Because he's using this to talk about the gift of these traditions and blah, 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 blah. I found in philosophy of religion class, like asking that, I had a series of questions Paul Ricoeur asked. One of them is like, this one, and be like, well, who are your enemies? And what is death? And like, let them have 10 minutes and write anything that comes to mind, and then just spend time talking about it. Another one he's asked is like, before you begin to think, ask what time it is. And you ask, what time is it? And then like the fourth time you ask, what time is it? Then you see the unexamined assumptions about what is important about the moment. And then anyway, like, but in a sense, like all three of those figures, Paul Ricoeur's recognizing, like finding the right questions that come to hold existential significance is an invitation to a more meaningful life. And one of the things you were describing there is a place where sometimes, like religions at their worst, you become more religious by protecting yourself from the very questions that would generate a story for any of its founders. Like religion becomes like Kevlar to the Holy Ghost, as opposed to like making oneself vulnerable or exposed to it. Yeah. And I'm sure our mutual friend Travis would like to say on behalf of Calvin, that's called idolatry. You know, but
It seems to me like these religious nationalist movements are really great at defining who the enemy is, right?
yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure they want to do with the enemy exactly what Jesus does, but
No, I didn't say they were good at following what their founders had to say. But I think that, like, Ricoeur's question, at least about like who your enemy is, that's the only question they seem to be asking.
yeah, asking it without the obligation to them on the other end, right? Like,
Right.
yeah.
Like, who's like, because those two things go together. Who's your enemy? Ask you to ask who you are, right? And who you're not. But then that question has to be balanced with finitude, because in the end, regardless of who your enemy is, we're all going to die. Joy Odolokun has this great song. I'm not sure if you've heard of her. She's got this great song. It's called We're All Gonna Die. And the and the chorus is we're all gonna die trying to figure it out. We're all getting by any way we know how. We're over our heads. So let's say it out loud. We're all gonna die trying to figure it out. And it's such a great song. I highly recommend her. And that balance, right? That, because there's the humility that comes in with it, and the one constant that all human beings have. And it seems like that might be one of the ways where our religious nationalist movements tend to fail. And it seems to be one of the things that even the nuns don't really seem to be all that concerned with, right? I'm going to die. And maybe that's the answer, right? Like, I'm going to die. And it's not nihilism. It doesn't seem to me that my nuns are nihilistic in any way. It's simply a fact. It's not anything to be afraid of for many of them. Not everyone, of course, but for many of them, it's not anything to be afraid of. So then how does that change, as Ricoeur would say, who your enemies are? And for most of my nuns, it's those enemies don't line up along religious lines. And that changes the question, I think. I think that changes what they're here to do and why. So this, though, is to underscore the fact that there is a growing divide, I think, in how people, particularly in our nation, are attempting to sort themselves into living a good life.
Yeah, and I think that question of the good life is an important one, and one of the shared experiences of that question, I think, for students is a sense that part of what our late modern context has done is told people to postpone asking that question until you retire, right? Like, with the good life,
it's much too late then.
Yeah, it's like, well, the good life, that's what I'm working towards. And one of the things across religious and philosophical traditions, whether you go through like all the different Greek philosophies or Eastern philosophies or the religious traditions, is the good life is a mode of being in the present. And the way economism, or whatever you want to call about the larger shared narrative, assumptions, and values of our economic and cultural system, is one where the good life is something deferred. And if you win at the game of learning to accelerate, become more efficient, accumulate, and all these kinds of things, then you'll get to have the good life as a crescendo, as opposed to what's happening in the present. And I think that one of the gifts philosophy and religious traditions do is like, no, well, the good life is something we, like, that is something we're enacting or not. And there's this temptation in our modern context to think it's something we eventually achieve. And the moment the good life becomes something possessible, at least the wisdom of religious and philosophical traditions is it's already escaped you, right? Like, once you possess it.
Right. Jesus would say the kingdom of heaven is now. The kingdom of heaven is near. Right. Was there some eschatology there in Jesus? Sure, absolutely. But over and over and over and over and over again, he calls us to this life, to the now, to the let's make this kingdom here.
Well, yeah. And the now part is an orientation to what's coming, right? Like, so, like, in a sense, like the already not yet dynamic of it, of a life in the kingdom of God, is like the good life is giving oneself into the next moment in light of the world's future in the love of God. And it's like that's what the good life does. And if you go, okay, well, I'll eventually get to the good life when I win at the economic game or the cultural prestige game or whatever, then you're casting pearls before swine, because like, right, eternal life is a way of existing in the present, right, which is the the way it shows up in the Gospel of John. So that and there's a whole way of reading Hindu and Buddhist traditions for making very similar points.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So
right, the Buddhist mandate to compassion is
Yeah.
definitely very akin to the thing that Jesus has to say about the kingdom of heaven being here. Right, you can't put it off to the next life. Your next life won't be the good life.
Yeah, and even like when you think of like the function of submission in Islam, right? Like the good life is related to giving oneself to that which is good. God, who has many names and can show up in all these places, right? So the good life is not one where you exercise or get to the conditions of perfect unlimited freedom. The good life is having habits and patterns where you submit to the good of the divine, because that's ultimately what's most good for all, right? And even yourself, right? Like what's the line? And it's similar to even Augustine's line of this, like, break the chains of my soul so that I may truly love you, right? Where there's a kind of freedom in being bound to the good or to love or whatever, which is a different notion of freedom than kind of a Enlightenment capitalist notion of what.
Sure, the freedom to rather than freedom from, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, and I think we're starting to see that kind of disconnect, at least lately, among my students. I have a lot of students who come in as nuns and find Jesus, right? Like one of our groups or one of their friends will bring them to Jesus, and they'll get really, really heavily involved in a church and in some of the things that can go real toxic with some of those kinds of groups, and then come back to me at the end of their careers ready to walk away from that kind of Jesus. And so we would call that deconstructing. And it's really a shame to see, because mostly at that point as seniors, they walk away and then they've lost the connection with the Christian group they had here on campus. They've lost their connection to, or at least their ability to come and see me on the regular to try to help to walk them through some of those things. And this kind of authoritarianism, this kind of who your enemies are, that seems to be really attractive to young people when they get to college and they're attempting to sort out their identity, doesn't always follow them into their lives outside of college. And we need to get better, at least those of us who can, at offering ways to help people reconstruct. I think you do a great job at that. I think the work that you're doing is really, really helpful in attempting to connect people like my students who get disillusioned because they got so loved and they got so much identity. And then they sat down and looked at it really carefully and were like, oh man, this is not the identity I want to have after all. And have to set Jesus down and walk away entirely. Isn't helpful. We do need more people like you out there working to help connect people who are deconstructing too. How can we connect with a tradition, with a truth about who Jesus is and how the world works, that helps us identify who our enemies are? And in Jesus's terms, who's your enemy?
Yeah. And it's not normal to think that the moment you've answered that question, you've also named one of the spaces Christ promised to show up, right? So, like when you think of the teachings of Jesus, like, oh, how you relate to your enemy is how you relate to me. How you relate to the least of these is how you relate to me. Like when you show up in community, whether it's just 2 or 3 in vulnerable confession, I'll be there. When you remember, how the state executed me on behalf of my commitment to the least of these, I'll be there. Like it's odd to me how the very spaces Jesus promises to be get undermined by those who are demanding or compelling allegiance to him, right? Like we know who our enemy is, but we don't immediately think, well, I guess that means I'm supposed to pray for them and
love them.
Yeah.
And share space and food with them.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I try to do here. Like,
that's awesome.
I can't force anybody to be anything that they're not, but I can create space where people can come together, where they can find their common ground, where they can share food and ideas and the common joys and sorrows of community life here at Lindenwood. And it seems to be, at least among those people who are leadership in the group, it hasn't changed anyone's mind about their religious convictions, but it does seem to be creating a space where we can come together. And that seems like this kind of communal space does seem to be a great way to combat the kind of othering and hate that is so prevalent in our society today.
Okay, I have one more question for you, and this is how has serving in this role and getting to spend time with students across different traditions and none, how has it reshaped the way you hold your own faith?
I was really lucky to grow up in the United Church of Christ, so in a tradition that is welcoming to basically everyone. So I came to this particular chaplaincy with, I think, a really good foundation to work in spaces where there are all sorts of different people from every walk of life. I can say that my work here, at least for me, has been an exercise in humility. So over and over and over again, I catch myself. That's not me. That's not me. Oh, wait, no, it is me, right? Like, there are things out there that I don't like. And also I see those same things in the way I do. And so over and over and over again, as I work with students, as Jesus says, right, I have to go back and look at that log in my own eye. And it has been so humbling, so humbling. And I hope that it helps me do a better job working with the diverse group. I've been trying to avoid that word because we're not. It's such a buzzword now, and it's been so outlawed by our current administration. But the true diversity of the people that I have here, it also makes me fall in love with this world again and again and again and again and again. Like every day, there's somebody out there. There's something that happens that is just, even in its difficulty, is such a blessing. So it has been helpful in encouraging me to, I believe, live the kind of life and faith that Jesus encouraged me to live, right? To love my enemies, to be sure that I'm judging myself and not others, and to maybe be kind of gentle in the self-judgment as well. Although I'm not great at that. But this has made me, I believe, better at following Jesus by encouraging people to be true to their own faith traditions.
Awesome. Now, you know that it sounds very reminiscent of Whitehead's other definition of religion is world loyalty.
It's world loyalty. Okay.
Yeah. Because usually when he shows up in philosophy of religion texts, they only do that one line of like, religion's what you do, in solitude, even though it's the same 90-page little book. a short lecture series, Religion in the Making, where he does both. And then I'm always like, to understand each of them, you have to read the other one. But world loyalty, like religion is world loyalty, right? That sense of falling in love with life again and these kind of things. Because, anyway, I don't want to go into an exegesis of Whitehead. That's not how to end a podcast. But
no,
just
let's do a Whitehead exegesis. I love it.
It happens plenty of times on this podcast. But like, if religion is a form of life, then one of the things is it's both how one seizes one's own finitude in relations, right? Like that, which is what I think he's ultimately talking about with solitariness, and then how that what you do with your own finitude and orientation is world loyalty, right? Like it's a commitment to the flourishing of all, and religion, that world loyalty, is like the affective seizure of that the world moves upon you, and like this loyalty to the world isn't just the world on its own ends, but the enactment of the world's life is the divine life as well, right? Like, so the anyway, I love that book.
It's a good one.
Yeah. But thank you so much. I'm glad you didn't tell me. I don't care if this old dude emailed you. Let's talk about something else, because I'm very happy how this conversation turned out. Like, Trip, why are you calling me? Just because someone sent you an email that you don't know how to answer it. See? So live research with Nichole right now on the podcast.
Well, God bless your chaplain friend. I hope that his retirement is as fulfilling as his service was.
Yeah. No, that's one of the things. It is going like, oh, well, that's a really beautiful description stuff. And then I'll just say, having someone of age recognizing that they might be too old to do a vocation well is a feature I'd like to make you more ubiquitous. Man, I don't want to name anyone, just any Jill or Joe out there might just say, oh, perhaps my ability to do something at a previous point in life, changing context and age, might make me less than an ideal, candidate, for fulfilling a particular role. And perhaps maturity is the recognition that
of what one's limitations are?
Yeah.
Well, sometimes you lose the ability to recognize things.
Yeah. Sometimes. I've heard it said that that's happened. And
if it helps any, one of the things I tell my young people is, if you don't vote, public policy will never address your needs. Because older people vote, and therefore public policy addresses their needs. So get out there and vote. Right? I don't care who you vote for, but if you want your needs addressed, you have to make your voice heard.
And then you're like, footnote, but I kind of do care who you vote for, but
okay, I do
that's not
very
the point
much
I'm making
care
right now.
and in order to be as much of a servant as I can to as much of my population.
Yeah, I understand.
Get out and vote.
All right. Well, thank you, Nichole. And I'll look forward to getting to do this again. But next time I won't, let a single email occupy an hour and a half of your time.
I think, no, that was great. I'm glad that we got to talk about the single email, and I love talking about what I do. And thank you for inviting me to be here with you.